Welcome to the Calgary Jewish Communities Literary Festival. I'm this year's literary chair, Danyael Halprin. Thank you for joining us tonight for this conversation with Israeli author and journalist Paul Alster about his political thriller, Kin or Country. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and honor the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the Treaty 7 people, including the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda Nations. Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Thank you for the privilege of working, learning, and living on this land. Paul Alster is speaking to us from his home in Israel, in Zikaron Yaakov, just north of Caesarea. Welcome, Paul Alster.
Thank you, Danyael. It's really lovely to talk to you. Thanks for inviting me.
This is so nice. Thank you for being here. First, allow me to introduce you. Paul Alster has worked as a news and sports broadcast and print journalist for more than 35 years, reporting for such media outlets as the Jerusalem Post, the Press Association of Great Britain, FoxNews.com, ESPN, NBC, Israel's One Channel, and many more. Paul's originally from Leeds, England, and has lived in Israel for the past 25 years. So Paul, why don't you give us the synopsis of your book that was published in September 2019?
Yeah, actually, it was written in 2019. It was published in the summer of 2020. But in brief, the book came about, Danyael, because of an interview I did for the Jerusalem Report magazine, for whom I've been a contributor for over a decade. And I had spent time in Israel from late 96, and then I went back to England for a while, and then I came back with my family in 2007. And in 2017, that marked 10 years back here in Israel, and I wanted to see if my feelings of the way Israel had changed during that decade matched with the official statistics, or was I imagining the way things were going? Mm-hmm. So I managed to arrange an interview with the head of the National Office of Statistics in Jerusalem. We sat down for a conversation and we talked about the standard of living and the amount of cars on the road and the price of food and everything else. And then one issue came up, which was the predicted rise in the population growth here in the state of Israel. Now, everybody knows Israel is a very small place. It's quite a crowded place. And of course, because of the shortage of land, that's what has caused so many issues internally with our neighbors. What even I wasn't aware of, and I'm embarrassed to say as a supposedly professional journalist in the region, was that in the next 25 years, the population of Israel is going to increase by 2/3. That means that on the 100th anniversary of the state in 2048, the current 9.2 million is going to be something like 15.5 million. Wow. Now that is a massive growth, but most significantly, and the biggest surprise to me, was that the majority of that growth amongst the Jewish population of Israel will be among the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi communities of Israel. And that with it brings all sorts of questions and changes in the way Israel is going to be. It is most likely going to become a more religious society. There may well become restrictions on personal freedoms that secular or less religious people might find very challenging. And so on the back of that, the idea was sown in my mind about maybe highlighting this issue. Initially, I was going to write an academic paper, but then I had the idea to write a thriller based on the scenario of a referendum leading up to the 100th anniversary of the state, where the people of Israel are offered the choice of staying together as one and trying to sort out all their problems internally, or because of the changing demographics, splitting into two, a religious nation of Judea based in Jerusalem, with its Jerusalem as the capital, and a secular democratic state of Israel with Tel Aviv as its capital. And that was the original basis of the book.
I love how one statistic can send you into a whole world of imagining a story.
Absolutely, yeah. A very, very significant factor.
Right. So I think for some of us who are only fed the news about Israel from sources other than Israel, we're only really given news about the drama, the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and really don't know about this conflict within the country itself between the Haredis. And again, not a term that many people are familiar with. I don't know what the meaning of that term is, but we don't know about the schism within the country and what privileges the Haredis have and what costs the secular part of the society has to burden for them, like not being part of the military, etc. So maybe you can illuminate what their way of life is, the Haredis in Israel, and how that affects the secular side.
Well, the Haredi is a term that refers to many different sects within the ultra-Orthodox communities, those that tend to wear the black coats and hats, the men, and the women who very often wear a hairpiece and are very modestly dressed. They have very strict rules of kashrut, kosher observance, Shabbat, and many other rules and regulations. And sort of the classic area that tourists visit to get a taste of an ultra-Orthodox life is Mea Shearim in Jerusalem, where literally for people that have never been there, it becomes quite a shock to the system, because it's literally like being transported back in time to the mid to late 19th century in Eastern Europe, in Russia or the Baltic nations. They live life very differently. They dress as they did in those cold, freezing countries. And here they are in the middle of the desert, still wearing these very old style clothes, very heavy clothes. And the most important thing for them is religion, the study of religion, the study of Torah. And they're traditionally well known for having very large families, because bringing forth children and multiplying is God's will as they see it. And the more children, the more blessings you have. The problem that many people from the secular or less religious or even modern Orthodox and Orthodox people have that work for a living and everything is that there is a significant number of the male population, and I stress the male population of the ultra-Orthodox, who don't work but study at yeshivas and other study centers, much of which is subsidized by the state. So it's paid for out of the taxes that people are paying. Also, there has been a long-standing pass really for the ultra-Orthodox men not to serve in the army, and that of course is a bone of some contention. And basically, if they're going to be a larger and larger proportion of the population, many of whom do not acknowledge the secular sections of society or the way life is lived in Tel Aviv as being normal Judaism, these are the people that are very often paying the bulk of the taxes to allow these people to study. Then there begins to become a conflict. Now, when I said the men, many of them, a large proportion study, it's the women not only have many children and look after the house and the children, but the majority of the women also have outside jobs as well outside of the house. So they have very hard lives. They work very hard indeed. And that in itself brings about a lot of problems and issues. So we have this changing balance in the society, and this has brought forth all sorts of questions, many of which have come to pass since I wrote the book with what happened in Israel in the last year.
Right. So a couple of questions that issues that you raised in the book are, should the countries separate into two different states? Who is going to be the army for the Haredi? And again, a question of land. There's not enough land for everyone to be moving around in the country to the two divided areas.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. First of all, I should point out that the book is a political thriller. It's about all the wheelings and dealings and shenanigans of the political parties across the spectrum. It also focuses on all the religions that have an interest in Israel, different strands of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And it also looks at the geopolitical implications with the United States and Iran both having different interests as well. And in amongst all that, there is a murder that takes place, and there is also a family that is divided between a secular section of the family and an ultra-Orthodox, and they sit on either side of the fence. So it comes down to a family emotional drama as well as a political drama and a religious story as well.
I don't know how you juggled all these plot lines, Paul. And they all come together.
Well, that's nice. I mean, that's for the readers to decide whether it comes together well enough. I mean, I'm pretty happy with it. You're never 100% happy with any book, but I think people have found something of interest in it, whatever point of view that they're coming from. Right. But as far as the separation into two states, it would be a very difficult and a very painful process. When I first came up with the idea back in 2019, it seemed a little far-fetched, although I did believe it was a remote possibility. Since the disturbances and the violence between secular and Haredi Jews that came to a head in the last year due to COVID and the lack of COVID observance of the ultra-Orthodox in the early stages of the pandemic, and subsequently since all the riots between Jewish Israelis and Arab Israelis as well, the prospect of maybe separating has become more to the fore. Whether it could be done logistically is an interesting question, which I try and tackle. Mm-hmm. As far as an army to defend the religious state of Judea, well, I suggest a rather unlikely alliance that the Haredim look to in order to protect their borders. But I think from that point of view, there would always be a feeling within the main state of Israel that they would have to do something in order to protect the religious state of Israel because of its proximity to the other side of the West Bank, Jordan, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of questions. I couldn't tackle them all, but I've suggested directions that people need to sit down and think about because I suppose ignorance is bliss, but I'm one that doesn't like to keep my head in the sand, and I think these are issues that have to be tackled.
Right. So you did mention a murder in the story, and I think that makes the tension even spicier in your book. My question is, when you first set out to write this novel, did you know there was going to be a murder? Did it sort of just arise as you were writing? And did you ever think that your first book would be like a sort of a murder mystery, political thriller?
No, I didn't. And I've got to be honest that when I storyboarded the book, because I'm a journalist, and like you, Danyael, I'm a journalist. We deal in facts, and our job is to report things accurately and to quote people verbatim and get everything spot on word for word. You have to kind of completely change your mindset and start to think about creating characters, creating dialogue and storylines. And it's a very different challenge. I storyboarded my book with the ideas I had in my head. I went abroad for a few months to write it, to get away from everything. And it became very clear very early on that as I'm writing it, certain things just didn't feel right, and I needed to change some of the characters. And maybe some of the goodies weren't quite so good. Some of the bad characters weren't quite so bad. Yeah. And the murder came in because it seemed to be a pivotal point that later on proves to have a very big bearing on the way people were going to vote in this referendum of whether or not to divide into the two states, the answer to which isn't revealed until very nearly the last page of the book.
Right. And is murder, like murder mysteries or crime novels, something that you gravitate to as a reader?
I like a good mystery. I like a good drama. I like political thrillers. John Grisham's writing has always appealed to me, as well as quite a number of other well-known writers. Yeah, I mean, I like to watch a film or read a book where you're really kept on the edge of your seat. And the feedback with the majority of readers seems to have been that once they got past the early stages of the book, where I'm establishing the groundwork and explaining to people, some of whom may not be Jewish, some of whom may not understand the Middle East, effectively what's going on and who's who, then it tends to be quite a fast-paced thriller, because there are a lot of twists and turns, along the way.
I mean, I think it's really something to write a book as it is, but I think to create a murder mystery is even more difficult, because you have to be very clever about dropping hints throughout the book, like the green coat.
The green coat, yeah. Yeah. This is true. And there's also to be the old red herring process. There have to be things in there that kind of lead people down one path. And They think they know what's going on. Mine isn't a traditional kind of a murder mystery in that you don't know who's done it. The question is whether the mystery will be solved in time to impact on the minds of the voters, really. I'm not going to give too much away. But there were also things that came along. For example, originally the main four political characters from across the different political parties were all male. And I'll confess to, having had somebody that was reading every few chapters and giving me feedback, and after about half a dozen chapters, this reader said to me, whose opinion I greatly respect, she said, it doesn't seem right to me that there's no female political character. Israel, in so many ways, a progressive society. Golda Meir was one of the first female heads, political heads in the world. And yet here you are in 2048 and there's no female represented. And I thought about that and I thought, you know what? She's absolutely right. I'm missing a trick here. So I changed one of the characters. They became a female political character. And I think that brings in more dynamics within the story as well. On top of that, I used a racial dynamic because the main investigator is an Ethiopian Israeli investigating the predominantly white Ashkenazi politicians. So that gives another layer to what was going on.
That's right. That's right. And so you mentioned all these different storylines going on at the same time. Have you had any feedback from some of these groups about your book, perhaps the American Christian Evangelists, and maybe you could tell the audience what that storyline is?
Well, from the Christian side, I haven't had any real feedback. I mean, the Christian evangelist side of things, I think was very important because I wrote the book really on the back of Donald Trump coming to power in the United States. Primarily, I would suggest, from winning a large share of the Christian evangelist vote. As somebody brought up in Britain and then growing up and raising a family in Israel, I wasn't particularly au fait with how strong the Christian evangelist movement is and its political power in the United States. That was until I started contributing to Fox News, when I suddenly realized that so many of the people that were following Fox were Christians, and they were very, very interested in Israel. Some were pro-Israel, some were not really on Israel's side. And what became very clear, and what I picked up in reporting on other stories, is that the biggest group of people coming to holiday and to support Israel, and in many ways support financially, are the Christians, the Christian evangelists. And Christian tourism to Israel outnumbers Jewish tourism by more than 3 to 1, which a lot of people aren't aware of, that they're not aware of that. When you walk around Jerusalem, it always used to be, when I first came here in the 80s, so many buildings were dedicated by different Jewish philanthropists from around the world wanting to contribute and be remembered in Israel. You go to certain parts of Jerusalem now, and you see signs of buildings and projects being sponsored and paid for by Christian Zionists, Christian evangelists, and some of them in the Orthodox areas of the city as well. So clearly they have an interest in keeping Israel safe as they see it, but they want to see Israel return to Zion. They want to see us playing it in a more religious fashion, and that's why I felt they would be more than likely to support the more religious Haredi ultra-Orthodox side of the story than maybe the secular one. And that's why I decided to weave that particular line into the story as well.
Yeah, I like that one. And I don't think the book has been translated into Hebrew, is that correct?
No, it hasn't been yet. No.
Right. So have you had any kickback from the Haredi population? Have they read, do you know if they've read the book?
I've had feedback from a number of religious people, religious Jews, who have read the book. And I've got to say, I was a little bit, not anxious, but curious, I think is the right word. I was curious to see what they would make of it, because I've done my best to make the point that whatever the views are of the political leadership of the different strands of Haredi thought, there are many, many more multiples of strands of opinion within that. It's not black and white. It's very, very grey. And I wanted to point out the very strong family values that there are within the ultra-Orthodox communities, the charitable side of their communities that support each other, because many of them live in poverty. Indeed, the latest statistics show that 55% of Haredi children in Israel are living below the poverty line, which is quite scandalous, really. And you might say, well, that's because they have so many children and there isn't a main wage earner in the family. And people can draw their own conclusions as to why those figures are as they are. But I did my best to try and reflect a lot of the very good sides of ultra-Orthodox life, as well as questioning some of the strands of thought, indeed the inflexibility and the intolerance of people who question. And that has been very much brought up in the news of late with the Kosher phone dispute that's going on in Israel at the moment. And most recently, the Din Rodef, which is an edict that was handed down in the last few weeks by some of the ultra-Orthodox religious leaders, and that is against the religious affairs minister, who is called Matan Kahana. And it's the same edict that was given before Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. And this is basically, it comes as a result of the religious affairs minister trying to break up the monopoly of the ultra-Orthodox parties on kashrut and on overseeing weddings and conversions. And basically they have passed a death sentence on him, which means it's open season for anybody to kill him, the minister, who himself is an Orthodox Jew who was 30 years in the army, a senior figure. And because he is challenging the status quo, they have passed a Din Rodef, which means essentially it's a mitzvah for whoever kills him. He now has round-the-clock protection, similar to that was passed on Rabin in the month before he was assassinated. So when was
that issued, that edict?
That was issued in the last few weeks.
Oh, really?
Yes, yes. And this is a very, very big issue. The other one is the Kosher phone crisis.
Yeah, maybe you can explain what that is.
Well, the Kosher phone crisis is basically, among the ultra-Orthodox communities, they have specific ultra-Orthodox mobile phone providers. And they provide their customers with phones that you cannot get an SMS, there is no camera on it, and you can't surf the internet. Okay, so they're called kosher phones, because they limit the amount of things people are able to do, and it's meant to keep them very much on the straight and narrow for a religious Jewish life. But for a number of reasons, the minister in charge has decided to break up this monopoly. One, because the people that are using them, the ultra-Orthodox, are being charged a great deal more by their own ultra-Orthodox telephone companies than the rest of Israel. And two, if we are a democratic nation, it is limiting the freedom of choice of the individual. And so he is challenging this. Now, this has caused a major, major panic in the ultra-Orthodox circles, because since the change of government, they are, for the first time in a very long time, out of political power. And if this is passed, then all of a sudden, ultra-Orthodox people are going to be able to surf the internet without the rabbis knowing or anybody else. And this could change completely the way they view the world. And this is seen as a major, major issue. And I suggest it could be a major news story in the next few weeks here in Israel.
Well, that brings up 2 points. One is, because your story is set in the future, 2048, you have some creativity with what that future looks like in terms of technology. So you have like self-driven cars or automated cars. And I see that you've banned face recognition for the Haredis. Yeah. So I'm wondering, what else do you envision for the future in terms of technology in general? And why did you ban face recognition for the Haredis?
Well, I think, I'm trying to remember, I think it was generally face recognition had been banned across Israel. I think that was just basically a human rights issue, that they had gone for that. I'm really not very good at technology, which is why you had to make the Zoom call to me. But I think there's no doubt at all that our lives are going to change massively. And of course, Israel is at the very cutting edge of a lot of the technology changes. You know, they contributed towards the development of mobile phones, satellites, drones, all sorts of things. You know, they've already started here having people getting their takeaway meals delivered by drone to your front door and all sorts of crazy things. So the world is going to change. And I just thought there was a real kind of clash, because if the religious Jewish communities are their raison d'etre is to continue as exactly the way they were in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s in Eastern Europe, they're going to be so far removed from the reality of life for everybody else that there will be these clashes and in technology and so on and so forth. So I do touch on those. I don't think I went into too much depth, but I think it is an important aspect of the way life is going to change for us all, and particularly in Israel, where we tend to be amongst the first to try out new things as far as technology is concerned.
That's right. And you mentioned the new government that came in to power in June. So it is a really big surprise, the absence of Haredi in the government. So, and also how diverse it is this time. So how did that happen? How are the Haredi not in the government, and how will that affect how the country will be run, and how will it affect the Haredis?
Well, it's a good question. And I've got to say, when I wrote the book in 2019, when we published it in 2020, the prospect of a government without Benjamin Netanyahu and without the Haredi parties was very, very hard to imagine. Now, we went through 4 elections and we got stalemate every time. And the Haredi parties were completely hand in glove with Netanyahu, because they promised to support him whatever, as long as he kept giving money to all their different ministries and all their various causes. And he was prepared to make that particular deal. Eventually, the vast majority of all the other parties, and in Israel there are many parties, came to what was the most remarkable understanding that nobody could have predicted, that parties as diverse as the settler party Yamina, of which Naftali Bennett, the current prime minister, is the head, that the Russian Immigrant Party, the Meretz, the left-wing socialist party, and Ram, which is the Arab Islamist party, amongst others, as well as the main centrist party, Yesh Atid, of Yair Lapid and others, that they would all come together in agreement to say, listen, if we don't all come together, Netanyahu's going to stay in power, the Haredim are going to continue to dictate to us all how we're going to have to live and change our lives, closing shopping on Shabbat, closing transportation on Shabbat, so on and so forth. And they came to this remarkable understanding. Now, I've got to be honest, I am a bit of a cynic. Living in this part of the world for so long, you do get cynical. And I thought, well, good on them, you know, trying to form a government. But even if they do form a government, they'll fall out. It's not going to work. And they had this rotation thing because Naftali Bennett's party only got 6 or 7 seats out of 120. And Yair Lapid got 19 or something. And they decided, in order to make a deal, Bennett would do the first 2 years and then Lapid will do the second 2. I thought, this is never going to work. And yet, remarkably, it has worked. They've made a few mistakes along the way, there's no doubt about it, but they've also brought in certain things that are very, very creditable. Now, of course, not everybody agrees with it. The right wing don't agree with it. Many of the religious people don't agree with it. There are demonstrations against these. But I think this government does represent the majority of citizens of Israel, which includes some religious people, middle of the road Jewish people, secular, Arabs, Christians, Bedouins, Druze, you name it. They are represented in this alliance one way or another. And I think it's something that nobody could have predicted. And from my point of view, as a middle of the road political person, all power to them. I hope they manage to keep things going, and it'll be very interesting to see if they keep Israel on the straight and narrow.
Right, and so Naftali Bennett will stay in the seat for 2 years, and then they switch over. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And At first, it didn't look as if that was going to work because they were struggling to get the budget through. Netanyahu hadn't passed a budget for more than 3 years. It's astonishing to think of any sort of Western-style nation that doesn't actually have a budget for running the country. But because of the stalemate, it didn't happen. But they have passed that, which means that the likelihood of a transition after the 2 years is far increased. And I think Yair Lapid will probably make a pretty good prime minister. And to be honest, I'm pleasantly surprised with Naftali Bennett so far, because he wouldn't have been somebody I would have supported in the past.
Right. So going back to that death sentence that's sort of been issued, I mean, how does a government control something like that? If the Haredi are not in power, how do they curb that?
Well, this is something that I refer to, very specifically in my book, that in the ultra-Orthodox communities, the prime minister isn't the head that they look to of the country. It's the rabbi of their particular sect. What the rabbi says and the edicts that he passed down are far more important to them than what any politician says. So even though they're no longer in power, the rabbis, if they get together, the rabbinical council, and decide, as they have done here, this din rodef, which is effectively a little bit like the fatwa that the Islamists did on, what's his name, the Satanic Verses author, whose name has just gone out of my head, Salman Rushdie. Salman Rushdie. It's very similar to that. For me, it's an abominable thing. I don't see anything Jewish about it. There's no goodness, there's no justice, there's nothing right about a din rodef. They're saying that somebody that is going to destroy the Jewish people needs to be destroyed before they can carry this out. And the religious affairs minister is a religious man. He just wants to try and bring a fairer way of running the country, because the kashrut, no business can run without a certificate from an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, which they pay a lot of money for.
It's about economics, so really, right? It's business.
It's about protection rackets, if you'll pardon me. That's my view on it.
Yeah.
And basically, there are so many people that are against this, and they see it as not being right. I don't believe I'm any less of a Jew than any ultra-Orthodox Jewish person, or anybody that has no religious belief at all. We're all Jewish in our different ways. And I don't see why the monopoly on the way that restaurants are run or anything else should be in the hands of one particular group. And it's the same as regards access to the Kotel, to the Western Wall. There should be access for everybody freely, and men and women in their sections, no matter whether you're ultra-Orthodox or Reformed Jewish. For me, I think everybody should have their place within a Jewish society.
Right. And I remember we spoke in the summer, and when everything was up in arms, when all the fighting was going on, and you actually said what was more frightening to you was not so much the Palestinians and the Jewish people fighting, but it was actually the Haredis and the secular population. And I'm wondering how that's affected your life, and perhaps if you will continue to live in Israel.
Well, first of all, I should point out that within my own extended family here in Israel, there are ultra-Orthodox members of the family. So I get to hear all sorts of viewpoints. I've also worked in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood of Jerusalem, where I ran a radio station back in the 90s. I got to understand a great deal about the way their lives work and what is important to them. But I also believe that there are a lot of people within this very closed community who aspire to a different life, but find it very difficult to imagine being able to leave that community without family, without friends, without an education, without money. There are progressive ultra-Orthodox rabbis who are speaking out now, and they're beginning to say that, we should serve in the army, we should start making up a bigger percentage of the workforce, we should go to university, so on and so forth. And that is very encouraging. But I do feel that although the ultra-Orthodox are out of political power now, just by weight of numbers and their birth rate and more people coming onto the electoral roll, if not in the next round of elections, then certainly they will be back in power, and their power will grow and grow. And I and a lot of people like me wonder whether the Israel they will create in an ever-changing society is a country where we'll find a comfortable place for ourselves. And it's something that troubles a lot of us. And it's the reason why a lot of Jewish people in Israel are seeking a second passport. Many people, many of whom had families lost in the Holocaust and so on and so forth, are using those family ties in order to get a European passport, because they're concerned that if things get nasty here, if there's Arab uprisings within Israel, as we saw in the riots here in the spring, if there's the clashes between secular and religious Jews, and if the Palestinian issue all comes together with Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and whoever else, this could become a real cocktail. And people, Jewish people, have always had the suitcase by the door, unfortunately. Nobody ever thought they would need to have that. And let's hope it never comes to pass in a Jewish, majority Jewish nation. But there are questions going forward. And I wouldn't say 100% I would see all my life, you know, spinning out here in Israel if things do change in a direction that I feel truly uncomfortable with. And I've said to my children that they should always bear in mind that the most important thing is to be happy and healthy wherever you live. And I believe in democracy, I believe in human rights and freedom of choice. And if those things start to be eroded, it would be hard to leave, although people say you have to stay and fight in order to maintain those rights. So there are a lot of questions. It is up in the air, but I wrote the book, one, as a piece of entertainment, but two, because I want people to be aware of what's coming down the line and to start to think now about the way they support Israel, the way they encourage Israel to be. And that's why I'd suggest people might want to take the book and read it through and maybe have a think about these particular questions.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to live on edge, right?
It is. You know, Israel is a country on edge all the time. My wife and I have a joke. You know, since we've been living here, we've lived through a lot, even in the last 15 years here. But very often I'll get up in the morning and say to her, "Are we at war yet?" Because you wake up in the morning, you just don't know sometimes. You don't know what's going on. Yeah. And it's a strange way to be. And of course, that's a melodramatic, jokey thing. But there are times when you do wake up and there are warlike situations going on. And I reported during the 2014 Gaza war in particular, where my reports were circulated around the world on the disinformation against Israel and against the IDF, which I took a lot of that. Pardon?
We need more of that.
Well, yes. Yes, I think we do need that. And, you know, it is hard to go against the flow, even for journalists. And, you know, I'm not unlike many Israeli journalists who have challenged questions to do with the way the reporting is done and what Hamas or Hezbollah have done. I'm not unlike a number of them who had death threats sent to them personally, hacked onto my own mobile phone from Hamas, threatening me with all sorts of nasty business. But you know, this is a very tricky corner of the world, and Israelis have become very good at adapting to live with it. But the question is, they're used to facing external enemies and dealing with them. The question is, are they able to deal with the changing dynamic within their own society quite as well?
No, it's interesting. You were talking about there's always the pressure and thought to stay and fight for the rights. And I was listening to the interview between Ayelet Sabari, the Yemeni Israeli author, and a Calgary professor that will be shown, I think, tomorrow night. And Ayelet has left Israel several times to travel around the world. And she was speaking about how leaving Israel, it's often seen as a sense of betrayal.
Yes, that's true. There is a feeling that if you do leave Israel, you are kind of deserting the ship. But I think for a lot of people, there are certain aspects within Israel that they find very hard to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not just talking on the religious or political front, the economic front. Only this week, Tel Aviv was named the world's most expensive city to live in. And yet our wages in Israel are not like in New York or in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. They're pitiful wages, really. And it becomes so hard for people to make ends meet here. There is incredible poverty that is not touched upon. More than 1/3 of the whole Israeli population is living below the poverty line. Mm. And this is a disgrace for an OECD country. And people go abroad to try and, you know, maybe find a better life, to be able to have a better standard of living. It is hard being away from family and so on. But you know, there is a feeling that you are deserting, but a lot of people have found that there isn't the place for them. On the other hand, of course, anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head across the world, particularly in the Western world, has increased significantly in the last few years, and people see Israel as a safe haven. And that's why I think it's even more important to be aware of what's going on, because if you want your safe haven, you want it to be a place that you're comfortable to run to. You don't want to be jumping out of the frying pan and stay straight back into the fire.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's essential, in order for Israel to be that home that is so necessary for Jewish people around the world, that whatever goes on here means that there is a place for everybody to come and be as religious as they want to be, as secular as they want to be. And we need to make sure that this is not a society that is tailored only for very, very religious people and not for those that are less religious.
That is a great ad, Paul. You should be the next prime minister.
I wouldn't have the job given, Daniel. I wouldn't.
I love that. Good advertising for Israel. So what's next for you? Are you writing? Are you thinking about another book? Are you allowed to talk about that?
Well, I have a couple of books in mind, actually. I've started well, there's one book that I wrote some years ago that I chose not to publish, that I am rewriting now, which is based on the wartime diary of a relative of mine in Latvia, who was the only Jew to escape Nazi occupation during the Nazi occupation, and he was helped by the OSS, the Overseas Special Service of the United States, in order to escape Latvia and bring messages out. So that's a bit of a real life thriller in itself. So that's one thing I'm working on. And the other one is a book really about my life as a Jewish, young Jewish boy and young man in Britain, growing up in the 1970s and 80s, feeling very, very English. I'm from Yorkshire. I feel very much a Yorkshireman, and yet there were moments when all of a sudden the fact that I'm from a Jewish background came to play on events that changed my life and changed my course, because I was never anybody that had dreams of living in Israel. It really was the last thing that was on my mind, but events conspired to make me think again. And I've decided to try and put that into a book set in the context of the taking through from the sort of the mid-1970s to the early 90s. So that's the couple of books I'm working on, very different to the one that I've written first.
Right. And as a journalist, then how do you go from writing a 2,000-word feature story to writing, 90,000 words? How do you know that you have an idea that's worthy of a book? Because what if you don't have a publishing contract as you're writing it?
I think, like so many people, you just have to have belief in the story and write it first, and then see if you'll find somebody to publish it. A lot of people self-publish as well these days, or go the halfway. I just think you have to have belief, but as much as anything, I think for a lot of people, writing a book is a cathartic exercise. It's an exercise in training yourself. It's an exercise in expanding your thoughts, expanding your writing abilities and styles. It is a very big challenge for a journalist to go into the novel sphere. And it's for other people to judge whether or not it's been done successfully in my case. But I would certainly encourage anybody that's ever thought of putting down on paper their thoughts and writing a book to do so, because they say everybody's got a book in them, and I'm absolutely certain that's true. I know as a journalist, some of the most remarkable things I've reported on are not big events and things, they're just conversations with people who have suddenly reported the most extraordinary facts that have happened to what they believe is a rather mundane life. But so I would say that everybody has got it in them, and they should really try and write, because it's a wonderful process. And even if the book never gets published, it will be a very big achievement just to have gone through the process of writing that amount of words and making it coherent.
Right. And you have such an interesting career. You branch out in all these different ways. Maybe you could tell us a bit about the horse racing and that you brought to Israel and that sport.
Well, yeah, I mean, I started off as a broadcaster and journalist in the horse racing industry, which in Britain is a very big sport and a social context. You know, a lot of people, Royal Ascot, everybody knows about, you know, with the fashion and the movie stars, as well as all the sports people and everything. And I was very much involved with that for many, many years. And when I came back to Israel in 2007, one of the main reasons was because I was asked to try and help start a horse racing industry in Israel for a number of reasons. One, because there were sort of rather ramshackle attempts at racing being set up locally. And also because they felt it was a very good way to bring people together, because one thing about horses is that it appeals across all the religious and social groups. And so in the time I was with the Israeli Jockey Club, we started staging major race meetings here in this country. And we brought together Israeli and Palestinian racehorse owners and jockeys and horses. And we got passes for horses to come from East Jerusalem and Hebron and Jericho, racing with the Israelis. And we had the most wonderful atmosphere because everybody left the politics and the religion aside. And we just had a day's sport. And it was a wonderful project, supported in part by who became a very good friend of mine, the European Union ambassador to Israel, Ramiro Cipriano Thal of Spain, who was wonderfully supportive, and we had some great moments. But the project didn't really go on for political reasons. There wasn't the political will to see it through. But I've always been involved with sports broadcasting. I went on to broadcast later on during my time here, the international figure skating.
That's right. Were you in what countries were you in for that?
Well, the last time I was broadcasting before the COVID outbreak, I broadcast the European Championships in Austria, in Graz, and then I went out to Seoul in South Korea.
That's right.
You know, that was a wonderful thrill, you know, broadcasting for NBC, ESPN, SBS, all sorts of big international broadcasters. So I've been very fortunate to be able to do different things in sport, in politics, in news, in culture. And I've been blessed really on that particular sphere. So, you know, I always believe that, you know, where one door closes, another one opens. And that's very much been the case in my career, because you'll know, working in media, it's a real roller coaster. You never know how long a job's going to last or a contract's going to last. And that's probably the way it's going to be until I eventually retire and hang up my pen.
Yeah, you do have to be quite versatile and become an expert overnight in an area that you've been asked to be.
Well, yeah, you know, when you used to get commissions to write articles, I remember writing one about a stem cell project at Hadassah Hospital, Hadassah in Kerem in Jerusalem, which was the most remarkable project to help people with multiple sclerosis be able to reverse the effects of it. Well, of course, I'm squeamish, first of all, which is not very good for a medical reporter. And I'm also a dunce when it comes to science. I got 0 virtually in every science exam I ever took. So I had to do a lot of research. But it's funny, when your mind is focused, you can start to understand it. And I remember sitting down next to one of the world's greatest scientists and professors on stem cell research, thinking I'm going to be taken apart. And actually, we had the most wonderful conversation, and I learned a huge amount. And it's amazing how you can apply your mind to things that are out of your normal comfort zone when you put your mind to it. So I'd encourage all people in the media to try and do things that maybe they haven't tried before. I know people say to me, how can you be reporting on terrorism at the same time tipping racehorses? Well, variety is the spice of life. You know, we're not one-dimensional people. And, you know, I think we can do all sorts of things. And I'm sure you do, and I'm sure many, many journalists do, without it becoming public, all their different interests.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. And I mean, I've heard you do the commentating on the sports racing, and it's also very interesting to hear you fluent in Hebrew.
Yes, sort of fluent. I do speak.
If you're commentating, I think you're fluent.
Well, yes, that's right. But I do make a lot of mistakes, which is, you know, been my kind of trademark. That first of all, I speak with a British accent, which sounds rather curious in Hebrew. It's a very gentle version of Hebrew. And broadcasting on live television, as I did with sports programs, I have made some absolute clangers, some dreadful mistakes.
Really?
Yes, once I got the sex of horses wrong, and instead of saying in a horse race, a horse had gone 3 lengths clear as it raced towards the line, I said it had gone 3 corpses clear, which was which was a little unfortunate. When I handed back to the presenter, he couldn't speak for laughing, you know, but these things happen. We all make mistakes.
That's very endearing.
Yeah, well, that's one word for it.
And is there, I know you talked about the books that you're working on. Are there some journalistic articles you're working on right now as well?
Well, I've got to say that maybe as a consequence of immersing myself so much in the subject of the book, and then I've got to say I was very, very troubled by the intercommunal violence here in Israel this spring. It was absolutely shocking. I referred to it in my book, and I kind of predicted some of it. I never thought it would happen literally within 9 months of this going to press. I thought it would be 20 years down the line. We saw some terrible, terrible incidents, one of which, the razing to the ground of the Effendi Hotel in Akko by an Arab mob was absolutely shocking. Became even more shocking when I realized that a couple of very dear friends of ours were actually in the hotel when it was on fire. And an extraordinary, very short story, 4 masked Arab men burst into their room while the hotel was being ransacked. And they thought they were going to be lynched, but it turned out these 4 Arabs were local Arabs to the hotel that had risked their lives to get in and save them. Wow. And carry them out of the hotel. My friend is severely handicapped, so she couldn't walk. She would never have got out of the hotel alive. They saved her and her partner and got them out of the area. So there were, again, it's never black and white, but some of the stories were just so shocking that I actually decided I wasn't going to write for a while. I'm taking a break because it really did get to me. Right. And I decided for the moment just to focus on sports, but I'm sure I will come back to it. Israel is a pressure cooker country, Danyael. Everything is exaggerated, and it highlights the emotions are so raw here. We all care so much for the country in all our different ways, but sometimes it becomes a very, very tough place to live. And I just decided to take a step back for the good of my own health, I suppose, as much as anything.
That makes sense. Before we end, I wanted to know if there's anything else you wanted to say about your book, and also if you could tell everyone how to get a hold of it.
Well, thanks for that, Danyael. Yeah. I don't know if there's very much more I want to say about the book itself, because I don't want to give away too much of the plot lines, but I just like to think that whoever reads it, whether you're Jewish or not, whether you are religious or not, if you're interested in a thriller, and if you're interested in the politics of Israel, and if you're interested in the direction that Israel might go in the future, then maybe you can give it a read and decide for yourself whether or not I've done the subject justice. It's available on Amazon. So whatever region you're in, you can check out Amazon and look for Kin or Country, and you will find it. The title of the book, in a way, says it all. It's a dilemma that people are in so many countries and in situations where they're having to decide what's the most important thing, the loyalty to their country or the loyalty to their family. And that is the central dilemma of this particular book. And I hope you find it of interest.
Well, congratulations on the book. It was a great read. I'm looking forward to the next ones.
Well, I hope it won't be too long down the line. Thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this Calgary Jewish JCC Festival. I'm very honored. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you for
coming here, and for your time, and for giving us some insight into what's going on in Israel. It's very interesting.
Well, I hope everybody's found it of interest. I would urge everybody to read as widely as they can about the situation in Israel, because the mainstream outlets often just gloss over things and give you just the headlines. Try and delve a little bit deeper. This is so multi-layered. There is so much going on you need to know about if you really care about Israel.
Thank you so much, Paul. Take care.
Thank you, Helen. Bye-bye.